My aunt pressed a key into my hand outside the ICU waiting room when I was 19 years old. Not a house key. A storage unit key, small and brass, with a strip of masking tape wrapped around the bow. Written on the tape in her careful handwriting were 6 words. For when you've built something real. She was talking about my mother. My mother, Lorraine, had spent 32 years building what most people in Baton Rouge, Louisiana would call an institution. Lorraine's fine portraits started as a one-woman operation out of a rented studio above a dry cleaner on Government Street. By the time I was in middle school, it had grown into the premier portrait photography business in the parish. Debutante balls, law firm headshots, LSU faculty portraits, the kind of Christmas family sessions that ended up framed above fireplaces in houses with names. She employed 11 people. She had a waiting list that ran 4 months long. She had built something from absolutely nothing, and she wore that fact the way other women wore jewelry. Constantly, deliberately, so you never forgot it was there. My older brother, Philip, understood the business from the time he was old enough to hold a light reflector. He had my mother's eye for composition and her patience with difficult clients. By his mid-20s, he was managing weekend bookings and had developed a genuine talent for corporate headshot sessions. He was the plan, the continuation, the thing my mother pointed to when other photographers asked about succession. I was the problem. I painted, not photographed, not edited, not managed client relationships or updated the booking software. I painted specifically on furniture. I had started refinishing old pieces at 15 after my aunt took me to an estate sale and I watched a woman pay $40 for a water-damaged dresser that I could see clearly and immediately was structurally perfect beneath the surface damage. I bought it with birthday money. I stripped it in my aunt's garage. I painted it in a style I had been quietly developing in sketchbooks for 2 years, a dense, layered technique that pulled from vintage botanical illustration and Louisiana folk art patterns. I sold it 3 weeks later to my aunt's neighbor for $280. I was hooked. My mother called it a phase, then she called it a hobby. Then, when the hobby showed no signs of resolving itself into something more practical, she stopped calling it anything at all and simply looked past it the way you look past a piece of furniture that doesn't quite fit the room but isn't worth the argument of removing. The confrontation that rewired my entire life happened on a Sunday afternoon in March, 2 months before I finished my associate's degree at Baton Rouge Community College. I had been accepted into the Fine Arts Furniture Design program at the Savannah College of Art and Design in Georgia, not with a partial scholarship. A full merit scholarship, renewable annually, specifically awarded for what the selection committee called an unusually mature synthesis of regional craft tradition and contemporary surface design. The acceptance packet included a letter from the program director. She had hand-underlined a sentence in the description of my portfolio submission. The sentence read, "This candidate demonstrates a voice that does not yet know how rare it is." I had read that sentence probably 300 times. I laid the acceptance letter on the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon when my mother reviewed her weekly booking ledger. I had refinished and painted an old writing desk the previous weekend, one of my best pieces, and I set it in the dining room where she would have to walk past it to reach the kitchen. I wanted her to see both things together, the object and the letter, the thing I had made and the institution that had decided it mattered. She walked in from the back patio, set down her iced tea, and looked at the desk first. She ran one hand along the painted surface. She examined the detail work along the drawer faces. Then she walked to the kitchen, picked up the acceptance letter, and read the entire thing without sitting down. When she finished, she folded it precisely along its original creases and set it back on the table. She told me the scholarship was impressive. Then she told me that SCAD was 4 hours away, that furniture painting was a beautiful creative outlet, and that the Lorraine's Fine Portraits booking system was going to require a full-time coordinator within the year because Philip could not manage client intake and shoot schedules simultaneously. She told me she had been planning to offer me that role. Competitive salary, flexible hours, the opportunity to eventually move into a partnership position. She told me it was the kind of offer most people spent years trying to earn. I told her I was going to Savannah. She looked at me the way she looked at vendors who sent invoices with errors, not angry, calculating, patient in a way that was more unsettling than anger. She told me that if I chose to leave for what she called an arts program in furniture decoration, she would consider that a voluntary exit from the family business structure. No supplemental income, no housing support when I came back, no position waiting. She said she could not hold a role open for someone who had demonstrated they were not committed to the family's work. She said she needed to know she could count on the people around her. I told her the scholarship covered tuition and housing. She walked to the dining room. She looked at the writing desk for a long moment. Then she picked up the chair I had painted to match it, carried it to the back patio, and set it outside the door with the careful efficiency of someone setting out items for donation. She came back inside and told me that painted furniture was decorative, that anyone with patience and a YouTube tutorial could refinish a chair, that I was walking away from something real to chase something that had a very small ceiling and a very crowded floor. Then she went back to her booking ledger and did not speak to me again that evening. I went to my room. I sat on the floor for a while. Then I got up, took the acceptance letter and put it in the inside pocket of my bag. I opened the small wooden box on my bookshelf where I kept things that mattered and took out the storage unit key my aunt had given me outside the ICU 2 years earlier when her sister, my grandmother, had been admitted for what turned out to be the last time. The masking tape was still clean, the handwriting still precise. I called my aunt. She answered on the second ring. I told her I needed the address of the storage unit. She gave it to me without asking why. She simply said, "It's time then." I told her I thought it was. She said, "Good. Call me when you get there." The unit was in Denham Springs, about 20 minutes east. I drove out the following morning. The key worked. Inside was not furniture, not boxes of old photographs. It was a filing cabinet, a folding table, and on the table a sealed envelope with my name on it in my grandmother's handwriting and a note from my aunt paperclip to the front. The note said, "She started this when you were 12. She never told your mother." The envelope contained a passbook for a credit union account and a letter my grandmother had written 2 years before she died. In the letter, she told me she had watched me sand and paint and refinish things since I was old enough to hold a brush, and that she had seen what my mother had not, which was that I was not playing. She told me she had been putting money aside monthly from her own fixed income for 7 years. She told me the account had a balance of $11,400. She told me to use it as a foundation, not a cushion, because there was a difference, and she believed I already knew what the difference was. I sat in that storage unit on the concrete floor for a long time. My grandmother had been gone for 2 years. She had never once mentioned the account. Not when she helped me carry finished pieces to craft fairs. Not when she drove 45 minutes to see my first real sale. Not during any of the Sunday phone calls where she asked specifically and carefully about whatever piece I was working on, the way you ask about something you have already decided to believe in. I did not cry in the storage unit. I cried in my car in the parking lot for about 20 minutes, and then I drove home and started packing. Savannah in late August is heavy and green and relentlessly humid. My student housing was a shared apartment 3 blocks from the main campus with 2 other students, one of whom kept a rotating collection of half-finished oil paintings stacked against every available wall surface. It felt exactly right. The scholarship covered tuition and my portion of the rent. I stretched my grandmother's money with the same precision I applied to surface preparation. Not a dollar spent on comfort that could be spent on materials. I found a small garage space 2 miles from campus that a retired contractor rented out by the week to woodworkers and makers. I paid for Saturday and Sunday mornings. I brought my own tools. I worked on pieces between classes and on weekends and sometimes until the contractor politely knocked on the door at 9 in the evening to tell me he needed to lock up. In my second semester, I developed what my program advisor called a signature visual language, which was her careful way of saying that my work looked like nothing else in the department, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. But she was interested. I was pulling from Louisiana Creole architectural motifs, overlaying them with a muted palette I had developed by accident, when my aunt sent me a box of my grandmother's old house paints. The combination was strange and specific and entirely mine. I started selling pieces at the Forsyth Farmers Market on Saturday mornings. I loaded finished work into a borrowed cargo van and set up a simple display with a hand-painted sign. The first Saturday, I made $140 and spent most of it on dinner to celebrate. By the following spring, I had a waiting list for custom commissions. I graduated from SCAD with distinction. I did not invite my mother. I did not invite Philip. My aunt drove 4 hours from Baton Rouge and sat in the third row and cried when I walked across the stage. And after the ceremony, she took me to dinner at a restaurant on the river and told me my grandmother would have driven the 4 hours too and complained about the traffic the entire way there and loved every minute of it. That felt like exactly enough. The years after graduation were not a straight line. They were a series of decisions made in small apartments and rented studio spaces, each one building on the last with the kind of incrementalism that only looks like a plan in retrospect. I moved to Charleston, South Carolina, not because I had a connection there, but because the historic preservation community was deep and active, and the demand for furniture restoration that honored original craft rather than erased it was genuine and growing. I found a studio space in a neighborhood that was still in the early stages of what people were calling an arts corridor, which meant the rent was reasonable and the neighbors were interesting. I named the business Ironwood Studio. Not after myself, named for the density and reliability of the wood, the way it holds what you do to it. I painted a simple sign and hung it outside. I hired my first assistant 18 months in, a recent Clemson grad named Aubrey who had a background in historic preservation and an almost alarming perfectionism about surface finishing. I paid her fairly. She stayed. By year 3, Ironwood Studio had been written up in 2 regional design publications and featured in a national shelter magazine spread on Southern craft revival. The writer described my work as architectural memory, made portable, which I found both accurate and slightly overwrought, but good for business. I kept my public presence focused on the work itself. I gave interviews about technique, about material sourcing, about the history embedded in the pieces I restored. I deflected personal narrative back toward the objects. This was not strategy, it was simply where my attention actually lived. My mother heard about the magazine piece through the Photography Industry Network. My brother called me a few months after it ran. He told me she had seen it and that she had called the work, and I am quoting him exactly here, quite accomplished for a niche market. I thanked him for calling and went back to a walnut secretary desk I had been preparing for 3 days. 8 months ago, a man named Fletcher came into my studio on a Thursday morning. He wore a canvas jacket and work boots and carried a leather notebook. He introduced himself as the acquisitions coordinator for a hospitality group called Sovereign House, which operated 9 boutique historic properties along the East Coast. The kind of properties that understood that the objects in a room tell guests something about whether the people who built the place actually cared. Their interior design director had recently concluded that the single hardest category to source for their renovation projects was authentic, regionally specific furniture with documented craft provenance. Fletcher set a proposal on my work table. Sovereign House wanted a 3-year exclusive partnership with Ironwood Studio to source, restore, and commission custom statement pieces for their properties. They were offering an initial contract valued at $650,000. They wanted the studio's story visible in each property. They wanted me to consult on the installations. They wanted what they called the human thread connecting the objects to the place. I read the proposal twice, standing up. I asked Fletcher for 72 hours to review with my attorney. He said to take the week. He bought a small painted side table on his way out the door. He paid full price without negotiating, which I noticed. That evening, I was at my workbench reviewing contract terms on my laptop when my phone rang. Louisiana area code, my mother's number. She did not open with "How are you?" She opened the way she opened difficult client conversations. Calm, efficient, louder than necessary. She told me she had heard about the Sovereign House proposal. The design industry in the South talks. She told me she was calling because she had a proposition for me. Lorraine's fine portraits had been through a difficult 3 years. Corporate headshot work had migrated heavily toward in-house and remote production. Two of her anchor institutional clients had moved their contracts elsewhere. Philip had left the business 18 months earlier to take a position with a commercial studio in Houston, a fact she mentioned briefly and without elaboration. She was managing a revenue contraction she had not experienced in 30 years, and she was doing it alone. Her proposition was direct. She wanted Ironwood Studio to operate under the Lorraine's brand umbrella as a creative subsidiary. She would provide administrative infrastructure, her existing client network, and the Lorraine's name, which she said still carried significant weight in Louisiana and the surrounding region. In exchange, she wanted a 45% equity stake in Ironwood and a production agreement to supply decorative pieces for the Portrait Studio's client gift program. She called it a natural alignment. She used the word legacy twice. She said it was the kind of arrangement that made both businesses stronger and that family enterprises should consolidate rather than fragment. I listened to the entire proposal without saying anything. When she finished, I told her I would think about it. This was not accurate. I already knew my answer with a certainty I could feel in my chest, the same way I can feel when a piece of wood is right before I've tested it. But I had learned to give myself time between knowing and acting, because the knowing that comes from clarity and the knowing that comes from old pain can feel identical in the first few minutes. The following morning, I drove to the waterfront park I go to when I need to think somewhere that isn't my studio. I sat on a bench and watched the harbor. I thought about my grandmother's $11,000 and the masking tape around the key and the sentence she had underlined in no document, just inscribed, and how she asked about every piece I was working on, every single time. I thought about my brother standing in the kitchen doorway the afternoon I left for Savannah, watching me load my car, not saying anything, not helping, just watching with an expression I had never quite been able to translate. I thought about $140 on a Saturday morning in Forsyth Park and how it felt like more than money. It felt like proof. I drove back to my studio, called my attorney, and signed the Sovereign House contract. I called my mother that afternoon. I told her I was declining. I told her I understood that she was managing a genuinely hard period in the business and that I hoped she found a path through it. I told her I did not have any interest in prolonged conflict. Then I told her the truth in the order it needed to be said. I told her that 9 years ago she carried a chair I had painted onto the back patio and left it outside the door, and told me that painted furniture was decorative, that anyone could do it, that I was choosing a small ceiling over something real. I told her I understood she believed that. I understood she was looking at the situation through the lens of what she had built and what she needed and what she thought building required. But that chair and the dozen pieces like it were not decoration. They were the proof of concept for everything that came after. Every Saturday morning in a rented garage. Every piece I sanded by hand at midnight. Every commission I turned down because it was wrong for the work, and every one I accepted because it was right. That was not a hobby. That was not a niche market. That was the architecture of something I had built correctly, piece by piece, until it became structurally sound enough to hold other people's weight as well as my own. I told her Ironwood Studio was not available to become a subsidiary of Lorraine's Fine Portraits, not at 45%, not at any percent, not under any name except its own. I told her I did not need the Lorraine name. I had built my own name, and I had built it in a way I could stand behind completely, which was the only kind of name worth having. The line was quiet. Then my mother said, in a voice that was quieter than I had heard from her in a long time, that she had looked at the Shelter magazine piece 3 times. She said the writing desk in the third photograph looked like it could have belonged in her grandmother's house. She said she meant that as a compliment. I told her I knew she did. I told her I hoped the business stabilized and that I genuinely meant that. Then I said goodbye. Not cold, not performed. Just finished, in the way that a piece is finished when there is nothing left to add or remove. The Sovereign House partnership launched 6 weeks later. The first 2 properties went live with Ironwood pieces in the common rooms and signature suites. The response from guests was immediate and specific. People kept asking the staff about the furniture, where it came from, who made it, The hospitality group sent me the feedback reports. Fletcher called it exceeding projections on narrative engagement, which I found amusing. I called it what my grandmother would have called it, which was that people recognize the real thing when they're in a room with it, even if they can't say exactly why. I brought Aubrey on as studio director. I hired 2 additional craftspeople. I expanded into a second workspace to handle the Sovereign House volume alongside my existing commissions. I started a small apprenticeship program for 2 recent design graduates because my aunt once told me that every skill you refuse to pass on diminishes a little, and I believed her. On the corner of my work table, between my finishing notes and a jar of pigment I mixed myself from a formula I've been refining for 4 years, I keep a small painted tile. I made it when I was 16, the first time I worked with the botanical motif pattern that became the foundation of my visual language. It is not technically excellent. The brushwork is uneven and the palette is muddy in the lower left corner. But it is entirely and completely mine, from the first mark to the last, made without instruction or permission or approval. I keep it where I can see it every day, not as a reminder of how far I've come, as a reminder that the thing I was building was always real, even before anyone else could see it. My grandmother saw it. She saw it and said nothing out loud and spent 7 years quietly making sure I would have the ground under my feet when I needed it. That is a specific kind of love, the kind that does not announce itself. The kind that simply builds the foundation beneath you while you're busy learning how to build. Lorraine built something extraordinary from nothing, and I have never stopped respecting that specific fact. But she confused her business with the lesson her business should have taught. The lesson was not inherit what I made. The lesson was always know what you're building and build it like it has to last without anyone else holding it up. I understand that now in a way I couldn't at 19. Not because I've forgiven everything or resolved everything or arrived at some clean ending, but because I have my own floor under my feet now, poured and set and level, and I know whose hands built it. If you have ever been told that the thing you make is decorative, that it has a small ceiling, that you are walking away from something real to chase something that isn't, I want you to hear this. The realness of what you're building is not determined by whether someone else can see it yet. It is determined by whether you show up for it every day and treat it like it matters, because it does, and because how you build a thing is what the thing eventually becomes. Keep showing up. Keep building. The work knows the difference. I think about that painted chair on the back patio sometimes. Not with bitterness, not anymore. I think about it the way you think about a moment that turned out to be a door you didn't recognize as a door until you were already through it. My mother did not set that chair outside to hurt me. I believe that now in a way I couldn't at 19. She set it outside because she genuinely could not see what it was. And that inability was not cruelty. It was a specific kind of blindness that comes from having built something enormous through sheer will and then spending 30 years believing that your path was the only real path. She had worked too hard for too long to make room for the idea that a different kind of work could produce a different kind of real. But here's what I have come to understand about the way things actually unfold. The outcomes in our lives are not random. They are the accumulated weight of every decision we made when no one was watching. Every Saturday morning, I showed up to that rented garage. Every piece I finished past midnight. Every commission I turned down because it was wrong for the work. Every dollar of my grandmother's money I treated as infrastructure instead of comfort. Those were not lucky breaks. Those were choices, stacked one on top of the other until they became a floor solid enough to stand on. That is how it works. Not fate, not luck, weight and structure and time. What I also know now is that my grandmother understood something my mother did not, which is that believing in someone before they have proof is not a risk. It is the only investment that actually compounds. She watched me for 7 years. She never once said, "I believe in you" out loud. At least not in those words. She just quietly made sure the ground would be there when I needed it. That is a particular kind of integrity, the kind that acts on what it knows to be true without requiring recognition for the act. I try to build that way now. I try to do the right thing for the work even when no one is watching, especially then, because that is when the character of what you're building actually gets decided. The intelligence I needed was not the kind you get from knowing answers. It was the kind you develop by staying curious about the process long after the easy enthusiasm has worn off. Anyone can be excited about a new project. The real test is whether you can be rigorous about it on the hard Tuesday mornings when nothing is working and the deadline is close and you're not sure the piece is going to come together. Staying rigorous on those mornings is what separates the things that last from the things that don't. And the endurance. That is the thing no one tells you about clearly enough. The endurance is not dramatic. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. It looks like showing up again the next morning and doing the work again. Aubrey shows up an hour early most days. I don't think she does it for me. I think she does it because she has decided that the work deserves it. I try to deserve it too. My mother built something extraordinary. I will never stop believing that. But she confused the size of what she built with the rightness of how she built it. The size came from discipline and sacrifice. The rightness, I think, is still something she is working out. I hope she gets there. I mean that without irony and without residue. I got there by leaving. Sometimes that is the only way.